Welcome to the new Lifeboat Hour. I'm your host, Carolyn Baker, and once again, I have the privilege, and I mean privilege, of having a conversation with Deb Ozarko, who was last on the new Lifeboat Hour in December 2016. It's a long time ago. Since then, she's written, and I say truly, sincerely, the best book I've ever read on our planetary predicament, Beyond Hope, which you can find on Amazon and Kobo, which I think may be the Amazon of Canada, but I'll let Deb tell us more about that in a few minutes. Today, we're going to be chatting about section 2 of Beyond Hope, which is entitled Awakening Fully, Living Fully, Loving Hard, and Letting Go. It's an in-depth exploration of what our planetary predicament is asking of us, not only externally, but internally, which is the part that very few people are talking about. Well, I take that back. Both Deb and I have been writing and speaking about this for a very long time. And I guess because we're soul sisters in this regard, I totally resonate with section 2 of Beyond Hope. So, Deb, welcome back to the new Lifeboat Hour.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn. It's wonderful to be back, and I really appreciate the gracious introduction. So, yeah, I'm grateful to be here with you today. It's been a while, so thank you for the invitation.
Well, let's dive in. You know, when I interviewed you in December 2016, you were about to hunker down and write this book, and I absolutely love what was birthed from that gestation. So I have some questions for you, and maybe first we should clear up what Kobo is. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Kobo is an online repository for digital books. And you're right, it is a Canadian company. It's certainly not as big as Amazon yet, but it's a Canadian company that sells digital books, audiobooks, e-readers, and tablet computers, and it's headquartered in Toronto. And I also just discovered that Kobo is an anagram of book. So when you descramble the letters, I guess, it's book. So like Amazon, the nice thing is that hosts authors on an international scale, and it gives independent authors like myself the ability for unfiltered self-expression on a much broader scale.
Great. Well, thanks for that explanation. And here goes the first question. Okay. Because a future for the human species is so unlikely, you're asking us to live in presence. And I'm wondering if you can give a general definition of presence. I'm going to ask you about specific aspects of it, but what's your general definition? And will you give some specific examples of what it means to be present?
Sure. First of all, before I delve into the bones of this question, I feel it's really important to mention that I live my life guided by my inner vision. So that means my intuition, premonitions, and other powerful aspects of my inner world. So this to me is the only place where truth resides. And it doesn't live outside of me, or it doesn't live outside of anyone else for that matter. But the way we live in our culture of external referencing, most people have forgotten this. So where I differ from most people is that I choose my inner vision over referencing my world externally, and therefore being confused and misled and lied to by a sea of desperate, culturally conditioned voices that aren't mine. So by living from inner vision rather than external referencing, I have a much clearer connection to the voice of the soul. Now, the disclaimer, that doesn't mean that I don't sometimes negate the voice of the soul and make stupid decisions. I'm just as guilty as everybody else. But for the most part, as I connect deeper within, that voice is getting clear, and I really do live my life by that. And so that said, for me, it's really clear that I have incarnated at a time, and I'm going to speak just for myself because I feel like that's fair. I've incarnated at a time where I'm going to be bearing witness to, live through, and die during a time of profound cleansing for Earth. That is very clear inner guidance for me. And it's also clear to me that because of what humanity as a collective has allowed itself to become with its death grip on separation from the natural world, the soul, and the earth, the planet is soon going to be devoid of life in order to heal from the blight of our separation to eventually birth new species. So this is my truth. And it's one that I know you've read my book, so you know that I don't hide it. I don't pussyfoot around it. I just speak it out loud. And, I don't say it for people to necessarily agree with or disagree with. I just say it because I needed to get my truth out of me. And it's a painful truth. And because my inner vision has never led me astray, I trust it. So as a result of that, I live my life accordingly. And now that I've evolved beyond the grief and the pain of this really profound and painful truth, I've moved into a place of acceptance. And in that acceptance, I really feel a sense of liberation. And I also see how the way I was taught to live in this world and in this civilization has prevented me from living the way I've always been meant to live, fully now. So because a future that resembles anything of today in the near term is highly unlikely, especially with the aggressive timeline that I carry inside of me. And for me, just as a side note, for me, near term is within less than the next decade. For me, there's just no point in investing my life in the illusion of a future that I can't have any control over and never had any control over anyways. I mean, that's just an illusion. So, and one thing that I've realized in how we are trained as a culture to live with a future orientation is that when we're invested in a future, we lose the magic and the beauty and the power and the tender sacredness, the tender sacredness of each unfolding moment. And there's no other way to really describe it, because now that I'm feeling more present, there really is a tenderness and a sacredness to the present. And by investing myself in a future, there's just no real life force in that. And, I really go into a lot more detail about this in my book. So I'll just kind of leave it at that for now. So to get more into the bones of your question, for me, and I really stress for me, presence is flowing with the internal impulse that drives what I know as my life. So for instance, I'm not sure when you're going to be airing this podcast, but right now.
Fairly soon.
Okay. So today is April 9th when we're recording this. On April 18th, we're packing up our 2 little cars with our 3 cats and our 3 dogs and the few belongings that we have. And we're going to be slowly meandering our way east. Why? Because the internal impulse for me has been so persistent and clear that I can't negate it. And nor would I, for the past few months, it just keeps getting more clear, more clear, more clear. And so I'm honoring that. So I'm staying very present to that internal impulse. So for me, this is a prime example of being present to what I'll call my capital S self, not my little puny self, or the essence of my being. And if that internal impulse says move east, I don't question it, nor do I rationalize or attempt to talk myself out of it or justify it with any sense of reason. I just allow the natural unfolding of the message move east into my life. And I trust that implicitly. So that's a fairly large example of being present. So when I speak about present, it's being present to myself. And in being present to myself, I'm present in the world in the way that I move through the world. So other ways that I'm present to this impulse, those ways are more simple. For example, like if the impulse tells me to sleep in and rest, I rest. If it redirects me while I'm driving to a swim workout, for instance, I go in that direction, no questions asked. I follow the impulse by continually being present to it, and I don't have to know what it means. So, for instance, perhaps it's going to take me to a stray animal in need or an injured bird that nobody else would care about or discover had I not said yes to being present to that internal impulse. And another side note, both of those instances have happened before, more than once. including the dramatic rescue of an abandoned baby seal. That was really cool. So perhaps the impulse is also redirecting me to prevent an accident or something unpleasant. Ultimately, for me, being present is all about self-trust. Another example of being present to the internal impulse is if I'm hiking with the dogs, for example, and the impulse says, stop, breathe, and take in the magical surroundings, or stop and feel the pain and cry and bear witness and hold space for the brutality of a clear cut. I'm present for it all. I hold it all. What's beautiful and what's ugly, what's brutal and what's tender. And the interesting thing about this profound state of presence that I've now discovered within myself, or recovered, I guess, with myself, is that I also feel detached from everything. And in this detachment, I'm paradoxically more present to all of it. So it's really difficult to articulate with language because language is so intellectual. So hopefully I'm able to convey this in a way that listeners are able to comprehend to some degree.
Well, I got it.
Okay.
It is really hard to articulate, but I think it's something that we have to experience. And the more we can trust and open to that, then the easier it is to get it on the level in which you're speaking it.
Yeah. And so another thing about presence, though, like when you say trust, like for me, that is really the key. It's about self-trust. And everything about our world conditions us to not trust ourselves and to trust all of the external voices that really are just, they're seducing us to consume.
Right.
Because if we trusted ourselves, we would have the wisdom to not necessarily follow this toxic civilization, and we would make decisions that are far more aligned with our essential nature. And you and I wouldn't even be having this conversation today. Right. So really, going back to presence, for me, it's about being fully immersed in the feelings that move through me without shutting them down or subduing them or trying to figure them out, and so on. So like if agitation fills my day, and that happens regularly, I'm present to it. Same with grief and despair and happiness and joy, all of it. So I'm present to all of that wisdom that emerges from the movement of the energy and information of these emotions and feelings. So, not only is presence, not only is it something that is about self-trust, it's also very visceral. Yeah. So like I just said, it's not intellectual. It defies words, because really words and language just trap us within the confines of the intellect. So for me, I mean, honestly, I truly believe that everybody knows what presence is. They just don't allow themselves to go there in our not now, which I say in air quotes, in our not now, or I'm too busy, or I don't want to know world of denial, distraction, and future orientation.
One of the best definitions of presence I've ever heard in my life. And I'm being present to your cat right now, who I think went outside. Wonderful.
He's looking out the window right now at the beautiful day.
Yeah, good for him. Well, I'd like to preface the next question with this quote from Ursula Goodenough, which is, I love this quote. She says, "I have come to understand that the self, myself, is inherently sacred. By virtue of its own improbability, its own miracle, its own emergence. And so I lift up my head and I bear my own witness with affection and tenderness and respect. And in so doing, I sanctify myself with my own grace." So I'm introducing that to ask you then this longer question. The second part of Beyond Hope is very focused on the emotional and spiritual work that we need to do in the face of our predicament, or we might say it's the work the predicament is asking of us. Many people have been so wounded by religion that they recoil against the words spiritual or sacred or a host of other words that describe a reality beyond the ego and the rational human mind, which I think in your book is something you call essence. Ursula Goodenough calls it the sacred self. Now, some people believe that such a reality it doesn't even exist, and I would argue that hard science, particularly Einstein and the quantum physicists, and the work of Ursula Goodenough herself, as well as the work of Carl Jung, have demonstrated that something beyond the ego and the rational human mind does indeed exist. And not only exists, but that we're deeply embedded in that reality, even as we ignore it and live lives of ego-based separation from ourselves, each other, and the earth community. I would really like to hear your thoughts, your feelings, your gut on this.
Well, that's wow. That's a big question. That's a really big question.
Yeah, but you handle big questions really well.
I love big questions. Yeah, big questions go deep, and that's where that's the best place to go.
Absolutely.
So I think, we could speak for hours alone on this question. So I just want to say, first of all, I write about this at great length in my book. So if anybody's interested in going deeper than, the limited amount of time that we have, then the book really, I'd have to say that the entire first section is devoted to a pretty scathing expose of what we as a species collectively have allowed ourselves to become by negating the sacred self. And we not only negate it, our entire civilization is based on the foundation of separation from our sacred selves. And by inculcating this separation into young minds at a really young age, we've given ourselves carte blanche to destroy life without remorse. And because this separation has been perpetuated for so long, we, and I say we as a collective, of course, individually, there's a lot of people who, of course, who are listening to your show who are on a path of awakening. But so when I say we, think about the collective of humanity. But we have given ourselves with our separation carte blanche to destroy life remorselessly. And we believe this separation to be real. So that's why there's no remorse anymore. It's just like I was telling you earlier before we even started recording, that where I live on the Sunshine Coast, when I first moved here in 2013, for me, it was just such a beautiful, sacred, quiet place where the people that lived here had a deep connection to the natural world. And in the last few years, it's been discovered by city people, and they're coming here now, and they're bringing that sense of consumptive arrogance and entitlement that accompanies a very separate mindset. And so I'm seeing more clear cuts, I'm seeing more logging trucks. The mining operation here is on high gear right now, and what they do is they desecrate the mountain and turn it into gravel. So I'm seeing a lot more tugboats on the ocean hauling away huge flats full of gravel to be shipped off to China. So this is what I mean, is this, as the world is imploding around us in so many different ways, business as usual just carries on remorselessly because we believe it to be real. So in my book, I call this the big lie. And there's an entire chapter devoted to an explanation of what I mean by this. But in short, by separating from the sacred self or the soul or essence, whatever you want to call it Fred or, or Fanny,
God,
whatever,
dog.
whatever you want, dog, exactly. Whatever you want to call it. Like if you're triggered by some label, then just think of something else, but it exists. But collectively, what I believe is that we've thrown away our moral compass and are therefore ruthless in our capacity to envision, to create, and to carry out destruction. And all we need to do is look at the state of our world to see how successful we've been with our separation and how we have failed the sacred. So those who don't believe in the existence of the soul or the essence or the sacred self likely also don't believe in a round planet or the biosphere that is in a fatal state of collapse. And frankly, I also probably wouldn't be surprised if they still wrote letters to Santa and believed in the big bad wolf. So to negate the sacred self is the ultimate statement of separation. And I believe that separation is our fatal predicament. It's not about climate collapse or nuclear war or artificial intelligence or Donald Trump or the NRA or even the breakdown of civilization or anything along those lines, because I really believe that those are just manifestations of our separation. It's about us as a species that has lost its way. It's about our addictive obsession with the mortal, profoundly conditioned, fear-driven, corporeal, finite aspect of what we believe we are at the expense of life, earth, and the soul. So there, I will get off my soapbox now.
May I quote you?
Yes, absolutely. I get very passionate about this if you can't tell.
I'm so glad you're getting very passionate about it. My guest today is Deb Ozarko, author of Beyond Hope and one of the most astute and articulate voices speaking to our global predicament in this moment. If you've not read her book yet, Beyond Hope, then run, don't walk to get it in its hard copy or ebook form. You can contact her as well and learn more about her work at debozarko.com. That's DEBOZARKO.com. And you can share the book or this podcast with friends. I certainly hope you will. And speaking of this podcast, I bring it to you for free as a labor of love. And I would love it if when you listen, you leave a donation as an expression of gratitude for this service. Thank you so much for your support of my work and also of Deb's work. So Deb, I've been on a spiritual journey all of my life, I know as you have, but more recently I've come to understand that the absolute crux of that journey is the diminishing of my ego and the flourishing and the expansion of what I call and you call the sacred self within us and within the world. Now, we all require the ego in order to function, and it's nothing short of ridiculous to presume that we can or should get rid of it. But for me, the spiritual journey isn't about getting rid of the ego at all, but rather constantly surrendering it or letting go of it or emptying it when it comes into conflict with my sacred self or whenever it interferes with my connection with the sacred self, with other humans, and with the earth community. So I'm wondering if you'd comment on the ego and its many disguises in the spiritual journey.
Okay. First of all, just to clarify this, I don't typically use the language of ego. So if what you mean by ego is I'm feisty now. It's the highly conditioned, profoundly separate, dominating, fear-driven, mortal aspect of our humanity, then I can speak to that.
That's what I'm talking about. You know, there's the ego that we need. You know, when I hear New Age people say, "Well, I got rid of my ego," I have to wonder, like, okay, who's got the car keys, and how did you last find your way to the bedroom? So, you know, we need the ego. But what I'm talking about when I speak of diminishment of the ego is that which you just described.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, and I that's so funny because those. Yeah, the New Age types, when they say they have no ego, are usually the most egotistical people I've ever met.
Absolutely.
Okay, so based on what we've discussed ego to be, personally, I think it's out of control in this world. And I'm sure that there's going to be no disagreement here. So, and I believe that the reason why is because this toxic civilization that prevails, it covets the ego and it nurtures the ego. Mm-hmm. So every aspect of our dominant civilization was created to program the ego in a certain direction.
Right.
Separation.
Yep.
And So separation, it breeds consumption. And in a consumer-driven society, there is no incentive to be anything but separate. So when I talk about consumption, I talk about consumption of stuff, of food, of technology, of beliefs, of attitudes, and so on. So it's not just physical consumption, it's mental consumption, emotional consumption, and we just basically give ourselves away for this society to keep, to maintain the separation. So, I go into a lot of detail ad nauseum in part 1 of this book to really, really drive it home that what we have allowed ourselves to become is just so far removed from what we're meant to be. Mm-hmm. And the reason I do that is because, a lot of people, including myself, when I was writing the book, say part 1 is painful. It is scathing. I just leave no stones unturned as to what we've become. And I do that for a specific reason, because it sets a solid foundation for everything that follows in part 2, which is Absolutely. What we're discussing.
Yes, it does.
So going back to your question about ego, so because the human mind is primal, still very primal in the way that it's so fear driven.
Yeah.
And it's therefore it's weak. And I would argue that it's relatively unevolved, especially considering that we as a species in our modern form have been around for, according to modern studies now, 300,000 years. Mm-hmm. You'd think that we'd evolve out of this crazy fear, but no, if anything, we've embraced it more. So because of that primal, relatively unevolved state, the human mind or brain or what, I don't really know like which it is, but that's irrelevant. But basically we're able to absorb this separation-based programming as truth far more easily. So humans live in a perpetual state of fear because of this separation. And sadly, most people are even oblivious to the pervasive nature of their fears because fear is so culturally accepted as normal, which I say in air quotes.
Yes.
So we simply label our fears as anxiety or depression, and then we subdue it with pharmaceuticals in order to carry on with our consumptive ways and support this toxic civilization based on separation. And the end result is that we don't trust ourselves. So this goes back to what we started talking about in your first question about presence.
Yes.
And when we don't trust ourselves, we don't trust others, we don't trust animals, we don't trust the planet, we don't trust nature. And then with a lack of self-trust, we judge and we loathe ourselves, we judge and we loathe others, we live with shame, and then we blame everyone else for the state of our lives in the world. We're afraid of having no money or not enough money. We're afraid to give up the jobs that drain us, the relationships that bleed us. And again, I'm using the term we generically as speaking about collective humanity. We, as a collective, long for change, but are terrified that it's going to happen because we fear uncertainty and the unfamiliar. So, in essence, we've become inert modes of corporeal expression with imprisoned souls desperate for liberation.
Right.
So what do we then do? We silence that unease by drinking and by eating, by, I don't know if this is a verb, but I'm going to just throw it out there, Facebooking and tweeting and gaming and shopping and gambling and, just otherwise distracting ourselves from the sacred self.
Right.
And either that or we medicate ourselves to numb that energy and information. So what we label as anxiety and depression is really, it's just the soul just trying to get our attention. It's energy and information. So we numb it, and that energy then manifests as anxiety and depression or tumors or other potentially fatal or, unhealthy afflictions. And then when we believe that all we are is physical or the corporeal, we are separate. So then the ego can rule and we live in fear. And when we live in fear, violence and brutality and judgment, which to me is the most pervasive form of violence, is all we're capable of. Now, on the other hand, when using my language, essence or sacred self, when essence is nurtured, it rises into consciousness and it merges with the mind or ego, using the language of this question.
Yes.
Creating an entirely different worldview and living experience. So no longer is mortality feared, no longer is external referencing the driver of one's experience, because you start living from your inner world instead, and you'll be able, then it's much, much easier to differentiate bullshit from truth.
Right.
And, you know, scarcity consciousness is no longer present. No longer is fear and worry a dominant force in one's life, and future orientation just kind of goes out the window. It's not important anymore. So really, ultimately, when ego merges with the sacred self, presence just becomes, it's not something we even need to discuss. It's just a part of life. So for me, living more from my essential nature, you know, I'm still human, so I'm still not exempt from judgment, and I can see it in myself. And the thing about judgment is I can feel how toxic it is in my body when it does come up. Right. So that awareness is allowing me to let that go even more. But living from essence over ego is, for me, it's living from the inside out rather than what the rest of the world does, living from the outside in. And I know this because I know both sides. I know about bringing the outside world in and calling it truth rather than living from the inside and knowing what truth is. So living with essence as the driver of my life is truth. It's real, it's authentic, and going back to the word I used earlier, it's also liberating because it's aligned with what I know myself to be as a spiritual being animating mortal flesh. So the union of ego with essence is difficult to articulate because, once again, it's so visceral. It's a felt experience. Right. And it's the mind is really quite incapable of comprehending it because it's so visceral, because it's so felt from deep, deep within. But when you're in your essence, you know it. And you know it because you're authentic. You feel like, I'm trying to find the language here. It's a remembering. Mm-hmm. It feels familiar. It feels like you've arrived. So, words
like
really.
Like a coming home, in a sense.
It's like a coming home. Exactly. Yeah. So words, it doesn't really do it justice. But here's the thing. I wrote my book. I would have to say that the first section is more geared towards an intellectual knowing, mm-hmm. but because I used really aggressive language that came from my gut, my soul, yeah. It will be a felt experience. And I want that. I want people to feel pain. I want them to feel that deep, deep, deep grief, because that's how they access that deep essence inside of them. That's how they liberate it.
Yes, absolutely.
So anyone who reads the words in my book and allows themselves to actually relax into those words can actually be a transformative experience. Because we are all aspects of each other, through my words, especially in part 2, readers have the opportunity to see their own sacred selves in the sharing of my journey. Because part 2 is kind of like a combination of what I have discovered in my journey, as well as my experiential journey. So it's I write from 2 perspectives. I write from a somewhat dissociated perspective, just throwing out concepts and ideas of my discoveries, but then I also share it from an associated experiential perspective so that people can feel and experience themselves, aspects of themselves within me. So hopefully that's clear. really, there were two reasons why I wrote this book. And the most important reason for me was to get what was inside of me out, because it needed expression. And then the second reason was to provoke insight and inner vision with the reader. So with this book, I bare my soul and I leave nothing behind. So hopefully, as readers go through this book, they'll be able to more clearly see the disguises that ego takes on the spiritual journey. And through offering my personal journey, which, it's continuing. It's never ending. It's like I don't claim to have all the answers, but I just share my journey to this way home. And, I just feel like by sharing my journey and bearing my essence and being so vulnerable and raw with my authenticity, that it gives readers permission to experience that within their own selves, because our society has created up so many conditions where we just don't feel safe. So I guess ultimately the book is kind of like a safe container for readers to experience within themselves the sacred self and allow that fear-driven aspect of themselves to diminish somewhat. So hopefully that answers your question.
Well, it absolutely does. And I really want to encourage people to run out and buy Hope, or get on your computer and download it on your Kindle or your computer or whatever. If you like ebooks, great. If you don't, if you want hard copy, then, it's available. So you've more than answered my question. And hopefully that as we have this conversation, that it will stimulate not only a desire for the book, but it will stimulate within people a deep desire to explore essence. And not only to get more information, which is one of the pitfalls of our culture, I think, but to go more deeply into what it is that you and I are really speaking to in our work. So I noticed that you have a section of the book called The Paradox of Community. And in that section, you talk about how we've defined community in a very limited anthropocentric way, in which the only community we could possibly have is with other humans. And you argue that there's an earth community that we can be connected with that can support us beyond being in a structured community with other humans. Now, while I agree that this is true, I also know that Western culture is inordinately extroverted. All the emphasis is out there, as we've been talking about. And doing the kind of inner work that you and I in our work are pleading for people to do, because we've experienced in our bones how crucial it is, this is not appealing to most people in this culture. It's a very foreign experience. And, I'm teasing you when I say that I may be the only person on the planet who's more introverted than you are, Deb. And I know how hard it's been for me to focus on inner work over the years. And in fact, much of that inner work I could not have done without the support of other people. For example, grief work, which we both talk about so much, and you write about so beautifully in Beyond Hope. Grief work, for me, I've been doing for many, many years consciously. And I was trained by an African shaman, Malidoma Some, in the kind of grief work that comes from his West African tribe, where grieving is 150% a community activity. And in that culture, or in this culture rather, one reason that people are so reluctant to grieve, besides the fact that it's so foreign to us, is that there's absolutely no community support for grieving in this culture. We're shamed and blamed for it. We're not lovingly supported, and in fact acknowledged for having the courage to do that work. And I don't know what the collapse of industrial civilization is going to look like or how it's going to play out, but I do know that if we don't help each other and face it together as communities, whether that's our neighborhood or a group of friends or a village or an entire city, we're going to be automatically toast. Now, we may be toast anyway, I don't know, but I believe there's immeasurable value in the experiences of helping each other and mobilizing together, and in that process, becoming each other's teachers. So my question really is, where's the balance between recognizing that we're enough and that we're already whole, and the interdependence of the human community?
Yeah, that's another really awesome question. I don't have all the answers. All I know is, I can share my truth.
Please.
But, first of all, this is really important. I want to acknowledge that I agree with you 100%, like 10,000% on the importance of grieving. For me, grieving is such a natural process. And there's such a, as painful as it is, there's also, using the language that I used earlier, there's a tender sacredness to it because it makes me feel more connected. When I cry and grieve, I feel cleansed. And I also know that my heart and my mind there's a union, they're twinned.
Yeah. Now,
like you said, we live in a civilization where we're taught to judge ourselves and others right out of the womb. Well, you didn't say that, but there's an implication there. They're basically taught that it's not safe to be ourselves in this world. And with this judgment, excuse me, can you edit this a bit?
It's okay.
Okay.
You're good.
With this judgment, there's just no safety in this. It's just another manifestation of our collective separation sickness. Excuse me. So we shut down our grief, we silence it, we medicate it, we bury it, and it's just there's no connection to the sacred self when we shut down all of our pain. And the thing is, it always leaks out in other ways. So again, like you've already mentioned in my book, I write extensively about the importance of grieving in my book. It's just, to me, it's a gateway to access our essential nature. And one thing that is important to note is that there's so many different ways of seeing the world. And this is both our collective and individual blessing and our curse. Mm-hmm. So, again, I just want to make it really clear that nothing in my book is a recipe for navigating collapse or extinction or grief or any of that.
Right.
Because I believe it'd be arrogant for me to believe that I have the right way, or that what I share is as my truth is the right way, because everybody is so unique. So what I do share in my book is my truth, and I'm stressing that. And I share it through my own personal collapse. And I share it, I share what, let me find the language here. By allowing everything I thought that I was, meaning all of who I believed myself to be in this world, when I allowed that to collapse, I evolved into a far more expansive and ultimately liberating truth. And I know I keep using the word liberating, but that's really, honestly, yeah, it's what I'm feeling so much more than I ever did.
Yeah.
And it just keeps increasing as I move into my essence. So again, this is a truth that defies the intellect. So bear with me here. Sure. It's all I can say is that it's felt. So my truth, as I write in the beginning of my book, is from the soul for the soul. So for me, community lives in the forests, with the birds, with the animals, with the trees. And I don't necessarily have to be in its presence, because I know that we're all connected on a much greater level, on an energetic level. So for me, community also lives behind the prisons of industrial animal farms and vivisection labs and fur farms and zoos and aquariums and circuses and pulp mills and mining operations. and on it goes. So I feel the pain of my community because it's my pain. I also feel the presence of my community because it's my presence. So for me, I find it difficult to relate to human communities because inevitably there are rules and there's leaders and there's regulations and there's judgments and hierarchy and dogma. So
could we just pause there for a minute? Because
sure.
when I speak of community, I'm not talking about organized, intentional community where people live together. There are many, many manifestations of community. I'm talking more, because I've never been drawn to that kind of community. I'm talking more about loose community with maybe groups of people who are friends, or people in your neighborhood, or people who are in your apartment complex, or whatever, people with whom you feel safe. I sometimes use the words trusted others. So that's my focus when I speak of community.
Well, that's a whole other realm of experience. And I don't use the language of community, but I certainly have people in my life that are like that, where I feel safe to be 100% myself.
Yeah.
Now, there are also people who I like to hang out with where I can't necessarily talk about my personal inner truth because they can't handle it.
Right.
So when I go into their world, I have to edit myself to be in their world. And I still love being with them. But when I leave the presence of their company, I feel an emptiness because I'm not able to be fully, completely raw with the truth that I carry. And I think that, this truth that collapse, extinction, whatever you want to call it, it's a hard one in this world of separation and denial. People just don't want to know. So to be able to find others that you can speak with, where you feel safe enough to talk about this truth and be raw and real and vulnerable and honest and not have any fears of judgment, that's really hard.
Yeah.
It's really, really hard to find that. And in my life, I have my partner and one other person that I can talk about to the depth that I feel the most safe with. That's all I have in my life. I have so many people who reach out to me who've read my work, or who've read my books, or have listened to my podcast. And, we have some email dialogues, but even that doesn't go as deep as what I'm able to, what I need for myself. Because for me, it goes beyond the intellectual, and most of these conversations are so intellectual, or people are trapped in so much despair. There's so much pain and they can't seem to move beyond it. And I get that because I was there for the longest time. I get that. And it's also crucial to move beyond that, to be able to expand into essence, and to be able to navigate these times with grace rather than outrage and despair, which really just creates more separation. It's just the other side of the fence of separation. And again, I say this intimately because I know it. I've lived it for the longest time. Outrage and despair have driven my life for the longest time. So reaching this place, I don't want to call it a middle ground, because on one side there's denial and on the other side there's despair. And in between there's this expansiveness of just like connection. And it's, so when you talk about community, to be able to find that for myself is really, really hard. And I would love to be able to feel 100% safe with other humans in that way. I just don't, and again, that's my truth. Like I said, 2 people, my partner and one close, dear friend, where I feel that 100% safety. There are others where I feel 90% safe, but to come home and feel empty isn't really what I need in this world. So that's why I go in a completely different direction about community. It's like, I'm not saying that it's true. It's like, what I'm saying is it's truth for me. And perhaps maybe people can open up the aperture of their own awareness so that they can look at community in other ways. Mm-hmm. So community for me doesn't necessarily need vocal expression. I just want to be able to feel safe. That's it. I just want to, for me, sometimes I just need to cry so hard that I feel like I'm going to vomit. And I can't do that in the presence of humans, because somebody inevitably wants to fix me, or they just feel like my pain is too much for them. So I'll go to the beach, or I'll go in the trees and in the forest, and I feel safe doing that there. And then I feel cleansed. Mm-hmm. So, I think I would really love to say that I believe that it's realistic to have a collective awakening to some kind of cooperative, self-sacrificing community. I've been there. I've been hoping and wishing and dreaming for that for most of my life, but it hasn't happened. And in fact, it's getting worse. And I think that people are just too intellectually driven to really, really let themselves go the way I do. So I know, like, it's kind of a strange answer to your question, but for me, my community, where I feel the most safe, is in the natural world. And I just feel like, it's all the more reason to be profoundly committed to the soul, because I feel like when I'm really connected to myself, I actually don't need anybody. And that's, it's something that I'm able to sustain to a greater level. And then there are other times when I feel like, I just even need my dogs. But I don't know. I don't know if I'm answering this at all, or if I'm just confusing the matter even more.
Well, there's no answer. It's really about you're telling your own truth. And my truth, I would just add a little bit to that is, it's just a thought. It's just a speculation. My sense is that in times of extreme crisis, when things are happening that look like, immediate death, or we're in complete crisis in our little village or town or wherever we are, and we are forced together in different ways through emergencies, through trauma, community may look a lot different.
Exactly.
We may be helping each other in ways that we never imagined. And community, real deep community with a spiritual essence, may come from that. There may be only moments of it, or there may be longer periods of time, but that it will look different than we imagine it now. I don't know.
Yeah, who knows? That's the one thing that nobody can predict the future. I'd love for it to turn out that way. I would love for it to turn out that way. I'm not holding out a lot of hope that it's going to. But hey, I am open for everything. But for me, like right now, and where we're at right now, with the knowing that I hold inside of me right now, community, while there's still a natural world that's thriving to some degree, I relish that, because that's what I need the most right now. But you know what? The thing about the spiritual journey and the path of evolution, as you very well know, is that it's constantly changing.
Yes.
So as we expand, I can't say what even next week is going to look like for me. I may need to reach out to community and just like really go for it and say, for crying out loud, we're dying.
Yeah.
Let's talk about this. Let's not skirt around the edges. Like, let's talk about this and be open and real and vulnerable and honest, and not pretend that we have a long-term future with this toxic civilization that is just destroying an entire planet that, without it, we're doomed.
Well, thank you for that expose on that question.
You're so gracious.
Because there aren't any answers.
There aren't any answers. Yeah, it's just sharing truths.
So the next notion that I want to put out, I won't even say a question, is, throughout the book, you talk about service with what feels like some skepticism. A couple of times you refer to service as something that's kind of codependent or something we're pushed by society to do in order to have a sense of worth. And you also quote one of my great heroes, Ramana Maharshi, who said, "Your own self-realization is the greatest service you can render the world." Now, on the one hand, the introvert in me heartily agrees with that statement. But on the other hand, I know I'm sitting here talking with you, that part of my work is to serve the Earth community, whether that's rescuing animals or fighting for clean water, fighting to save forests, helping homeless people, volunteering as a hospice worker for people or animals, becoming a first responder, and God knows what else, because the world is nothing if not broken. And I feel for myself that if I have 1 ounce of compassion in me, says me, I need to allow the power of heartbreak to take me to places of service that are calling me, that maybe I can't even imagine right now. So please share with us your thoughts, your truth on service in this context.
Okay, so this is important to clarify because throughout the book, I make it very clear, right from the very first paragraph, that my life has actually been dedicated to what you call service.
Yeah.
Now, for me, it was a lifetime of animal rights, women's rights, and environmental activism. So for me, service was manifested through activism. And it was also volunteering at animal shelters, wildlife rescue centers, helping the homeless. And then right up to 3 years of the podcast, which was just like you, it was just self-sacrifice and service because I want to see a better world. I'm hungry for it. So whatever I can do to create that out there and in here, I was doing it. And it's, my book Unplug was all about, it was completely, it's all activism as well. And right up to Beyond Hope. So that's my life. It's so I you get the point here. So I know service intimately. It's defined me from pretty well my emergence from the womb. And compassion is and always has been the defining essential expression of my life. And at an early age, I even fought my parents, and I had to fight. I fought my parents for the right to honor my profound sense of compassion for animals and earth by eliminating the brutal suffering and death of animals from my plate. Now, really, I had to fight for my compassion. Isn't that right there?
Yeah.
At an early age, it says so much about how we're conditioned to be separate and normalize it at an early age. So, not many kids are aware enough or courageous enough, I'm not going to say care enough, because I do believe that kids innately care. They just don't have the awareness to do that. Right. But I did. There was something inside of me that knew it was wrong, and I stood for that right from the start. So I learned about fighting for truth and activism right there with my father, especially. Sure. So that compassion for me has just deepened over the years. And I know your passion for service better than, I'm just going to say it, better than most. And that's what I write about a lot throughout my book. Now, I also know something far greater beyond service, and that is recent for me. And this is what I write about in the book. Now, I feel like I've evolved beyond service, and this is what I discuss in the latter sections of my book, which is where the skepticism comes up. And really, that skepticism is almost like me slapping my own hand for getting so caught up in something when there was something so much more. So without getting into too much detail, because honestly, again, I could be here for hours trying to articulate what's in my book. What I explain is the personal collapse that I've undergone in my book. And that happened in the past couple of years. And it was all based on the foundation of this dire truth that I'm carrying about biosphere collapse. And it's haunted me for years, but it's just really surfaced in the last few years. So with that personal collapse, I allowed myself to fall apart. And it was the most painful experience of my life. And using liberation again, that word, it was also the most liberating experience of my life when I came through the other side. So emerging from the, I'll just call it the dissolution of my small self. So emerging from that dissolution of self, I am no longer bound to any sense of identity. I don't feel any relation to, like, if people say, if they use that antiquated question that I find so bizarre now, like, what do you do? What do you do for a living? Well, I live, for crying out loud. That's my answer now. Like, what do I do? I don't feel like I'm an author or a graphic designer or a podcast host or an activist. I don't feel any connection to that anymore. So I don't feel any sense of identity. It just feels, I feel free from identity. Mm-hmm. So that family hero archetype, which incidentally is a family system role that pretty well all activists and those who feel compelled to serve fall into, and I was guilty of that, that archetype no longer suffocates me. So in the flames of that dissolution, that archetype vanished. And what emerged on the other side of this is something that is far more liberating and far more aligned with the very essence of my deepest caring and compassion. And I call that activated presence, which is committed to nothing, yet connected to all. So it's spontaneous in nature, and it really brings me back to the answer I shared with you in your question about presence. It's about being present, engaged, and activated, and not for any outcome. Like, for instance, to save the world, which I say in air quotes, especially a world that I no longer subscribe to. But instead, it's because it's an expression of the deepest core of my essential nature, or my sacred self. So I dedicate the final chapter of Beyond Hope to sharing my evolution into activated presence, not just from serving, but just my whole evolution into this, and how I share how activated presence shows up in my life. So for me, it is far greater than being bound to service and self-sacrifice, because there is no sacrifice in activated presence. And it really is, as Maharishi says, your own self-realization is the greatest service you can render the world. I love that quote.
Yeah, beautiful quote.
So in that, every expression of my being is one that honors life and soul. So I'm just going to quote something. I had a recent email discussion with my dear friend, Louise Lebrun, who wrote the foreword in my book.
Yes.
So I'm just going to paraphrase something she said. She said, as a living expression of the soul in matter through form, I am not here to be in service or to serve. I am here to follow the inner cues that allow the soul to most fully express in this world of matter. And in so doing, contribution happens without effort, without directed intention, and without any sense of other. And when I read that, I thought, oh, wow, like she just has this ability to articulate things that I struggle with. So when she means other, when I mean other, it's what I realized is that when I'm in service, there's always some lesser being who will benefit from my greater, which I say in air quotes again, from my greater presence. Someone or something that is helpless and not able, but I am. So when I let go of my attachment to the word service, and when I really started to look through it through that more expansive lens, and I had to let go of my own attachment to service, because I had a lot of it, especially as an activist for so long, I was able to see that almost like the arrogance in the way I was. And I couldn't see that before because I was so deeply enmeshed in my activist identity. So the fun part about being more connected to the soul is that there's no other. And in being fully present to my sacred self and expressing from that, life expands. So now, in your question, you mentioned something about fighting for clean water and fighting to save forests and so on. And for me, my life was defined by fighting. As I mentioned right in the very beginning of this answer, I was fighting my father for the right to be compassionate. Mm-hmm. So now I see fighting from a different perspective. I see fighting and resisting, especially the inevitable that's playing out, is like fighting and resisting death. It just makes it more painful when it doesn't need to be so. And personally, I've reached a point where I'm tired of fighting and resisting. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't still feel outrage and despair. I do. It just moves through me quicker. So for me, it's far more empowering to hold space and move into acceptance. And it's a very tender and empowering and liberating place to stand. And with the aggressive timeline and very clear inner truth of a lifeless planet in my lifetime that I carry, again, my truth, acceptance is the place I've now reached, and I choose to live my life accordingly. And it's not easy. And, sometimes it's easier than others, but, it's challenging. But neither is bearing witness to losing what I love, But again, is it sacred? Yes, absolutely. Is it expansive? Yes. Is it liberating? Absolutely. It also reveals to me more of my essential nature, that part of me that knows only compassion and truth and kindness and caring and courage. So ultimately, what I write about is this liberation that I've discovered for myself. That was hard. And I would really invite, both you and listeners to consider who they would be if they let go of the identity of one who serves. Because I know for myself, the initial answer was, will I be nothing? But that was where the magic lies. So in stepping into that nothingness, there was space to finally become so much more. And there was also room for activated presence. So that's my long-winded answer to the question about service and skepticism and stuff. I only say it because I know something much more beyond that now.
Thank you for that elucidation of your truth. So I have one more thing to throw out for our conversation. In your expose there, you were speaking of holding space. And, you and I know that business as usual is over, and it has been for a long time. But we don't know what the future looks like, as we've both said today. We don't know what the planet's going to look like in 5, 10 years, 100 years, or, that's unimaginable to me. But we don't know how the 6th great extinction is going to play out, and if there will absolutely be no life left on Earth, if there will be pockets of extinction here and there with billions of humans and animals wiped out, or if there'll be areas of the planet that are relatively unscathed. We just don't know with certainty. And I want to share how I'm holding my work these days, which sounds a little bit like how you're holding yours. And I'd like to check in with you and see if it resonates with you. From my perspective, those of us who realize the severity of our predicament know that we're inhabiting the last years, the last months, the last hours of life on Earth. And if we're awake to it, I believe it's our moral obligation to hold space for whatever follows. And I'd like to say a bit about holding space, which I'm sure you can relate to. I've done it for many, many years in workshops. You hold an intention, you hold a place of safety so that people can do the work that they need to do or whatever, a safe container. So in this moment, in 2018, I see my work not as leaving a legacy, which is all about the ego, but holding space for whatever comes next. Perhaps in the books I've written or the podcasts I've created, the workshops and classes that I've offered, the coaching and spiritual guidance that I've provided, there will be tools that whoever's alive going forward can pick up and utilize in some way for alleviating suffering, for healing, for transformation of consciousness. Likewise, a hospice volunteer might be holding space for a person so that they can die, or a midwife might be holding space so that a baby can be born. So I'd love to know your thoughts about all this, about holding space for what comes next.
Yeah, my thoughts on this question are like a big yes. I have a big yes party going on in my body. Yes to everything you say. One thing we are so profoundly conditioned to believe as a species is that we're worthless if we're not constantly doing. And the more, the better. We completely negate the being aspect of what we are. And by negating being, most humans are not only incapable of holding space, they don't even know what it means.
Right.
So as a result, there's crucial transformative energies missing in the world that I believe are more important now than ever. And because we live in a world of antiquated Newtonian thinking, now, because you mentioned earlier the quantum paradigm, which is all about energy, and Newtonian thinking is all about matter. We're indefinitely trapped within the confines of that Newtonian thinking.
Right.
So in fact, there's actually a chapter in my book titled Being is More Than Enough that delves deeply into the power of being and ultimately what that means for holding space. And one thing I know in my own life, through my own personal experience, is the power of holding space. In my own experiences in workshops and in retreats, and even in being in the presence of loved ones who are grieving or dying, there is nothing, and I mean nothing, more powerful than holding space. And I've been on both the giving and the receiving ends of space being held for me and holding space for others. And I'm going to use the word sacred again. It's such a sacred, tender experience. And it has profound healing and transformative energies. In fact, it really does, again, defy words because it's a felt experience. It's funny, when you think that if we're just in a safe space with other people or wherever that may be, with or without other people, when we're in a place where space is being held for us and nothing is being said or done, that it would be like, it wouldn't be so transformative, but it actually is. So it defies words. You know that. So what's interesting about this question and this topic is that it has really been occupying my thoughts to a greater and greater degree as the clock continues to tick onwards towards whatever the end is going to look like for us. So going back to what you said, something early, in the first, I think it was in the first question you asked about the quantum perspective. Mm-hmm. You mentioned something about quantum. What was it about spiritual energy?
Well, the quantum physics is expanding our awareness of what's real, and it's showing us that there is a sacred self. In here, out there, everything's connected, and
right.
There's another dimension beyond the rational mind and the human ego.
Exactly. Okay, so. When you mentioned that kind of sparked some thought here about the quantum. So the quantum perspective, again, is about energy. So mm-hmm. It's something I believe relates closely to the power of holding space. Mm-hmm. And, I've been thinking about the relation between the quantum perspective and energy and holding space, but I haven't fully been able to formulate my thoughts on this. But what I do know, and this is it's an inner truth knowing, so not an intellectual knowing, is that holding space is the missing link. So because, we've been talking about this a lot in this conversation, because we live in a world where we don't feel safe with each other, there's no incentive for grieving or for healing or for doing personal healing and transformative work, because we're too busy protecting ourselves from each other because judgment is so pervasive, like I mentioned earlier. And therefore, there's no trust. So there's kind of like a full circle conversation going on here. And so the human species remains inert in its antiquated mode of thinking and behaving in the world as a result. So holding space to me changes everything. Mm-hmm. When space is being held, when there is a safe container, healing and transformation can occur in minutes and even seconds. You don't need talk therapy. You don't need to talk about it. Right. It just happens. And when we feel safe enough to be fully ourselves, wounds and warts and all, it's that raw, vulnerable authenticity that brings us home to the soul. So, this brings me back to your question about community. So for me, community is about non-judgment and holding space. Mm-hmm. And this is what I get from my community of animals in the natural world. I am always able to be 100% me all of the time. And there's no judgment, no fear, no separation. And in the safety of this container, I'm able to remember what I am when I fall into despair or outrage over the insanity of this world. And when I'm able to return to my essence, I'm able to return to activated presence, and there's no longer any need to resist or fight the inevitable. And it then becomes the power of acceptance and all about loving what is right now and expressing the compassionate essence of my being, regardless of outcome. So to me, that's holding space. That's the power of holding space. Like for me, I hope I'm articulating this well, because I'm very passionate about it, and it's again, it defies words. But ultimately, it helps me express more from the soul, and it helps me reclaim activated presence. So from a quantum or energetic perspective, I believe that holding space is actually the simple miracle that we've needed all along. I'm really glad that you brought this question into the conversation today.
Well, here we are at the end of our questions, air quotes, and certainly neither one of us having answers, but it has been so wonderful and liberating and refreshing to hear your truth. And I cannot urge people enough to get a copy of Beyond Hope and really dive into what Deb is sharing with us in this book, what she's sharing with us in this podcast, and to go deep with it, to allow yourself to go deep with it, into the grief, into the love, because grief is love, into the fear, into whatever you're feeling. I thank you all so much for being with us today. And Deb Ozarko, thank you for your work in the world, for what you've given us in the book and your book, Unplug. Thank you for holding space for transformation. And it is really a joy to know you.
Right back at you, Carolyn. Thank you. Thank you.
And to all of you listening to us today, until next time, stay well, stay safe, and stay awake.